Before moving to the panel discussion, there are a few reminders. First, there will be a lucky draw at the end of today. Please make sure you have registered and drop your name card at the registration counter. Second, we welcome all of your feedback to WIDS. Please fill in the feedback form and return to the registration counter. Third, Internet Society Hong Kong would like to invite you to join us as a member. To get the most up-to-date information, it is free to join as general member. Let's don't hesitate to proceed to panel discussion. We will have our Mr. George Aberon, Postmaster at Twitter, as our moderator of today's panel discussion. And we will discuss what is next about big data and cloud. Mr. Parash Sundaresan from Microsoft, Ms. Kim Skin from MongoDB, and Mr. C.L. Cole from GovernZero.tw, and Matt from Dropbox as our panelists. Let's give them a big hand.
These are comfy. These are pretty comfy. It's like a little fireside chat.
Yeah, as Max just said there, we're going to have a little fireside chat here. So whenever I do a panel, I like to keep it pretty free form. So if questions come up as we're talking, please just put up your hand. We'll get you a mic and we'll involve questions from the audience in the panel at the same time.
Can we ask questions, Steve?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. So, this panel's on big data and cloud, and one of the things I always like to ask about big data is, there's a lot of hype on big data. Is big data worthy of this hype?
I have an answer for this.
And you're with MongoDB.
Yes, I am.
I'm shocked you'd have an answer for this one.
Yes, I have an answer for this. You'll excuse the analogy, but I saw what the T-shirts say, so I feel I can say this. Big data, it's like teenage sex. Everybody talks about it.
I wouldn't know about that.
Everybody talks about it. Nobody's actually doing it. The few who are doing it are not doing a very good job. And everybody thinks that everybody else is doing it, so they say they're doing it too. Right? I didn't make this up. I stole this shamelessly. Just Google big data teenage sex, you'll see the original slide. But it rings very true because, frankly, our experience is nobody really knows what, when they call us and say we want to talk to you because we're concerned about big data, and we say basically what do you mean by that, and they usually go, we were hoping you could tell us. Right? It's because people are aware that there's a lot of data and they feel like they're missing out on something very important if they can't get the intelligence out of it that they feel everybody else is able to, right?
So if I may add to that, I think it's very true. There's a lot more talk about big data than there actually is use of big data. But I think there's a key inflection point, which is why this whole phenomenon is taking place, right? The incremental cost of storing a piece of data obviously has been going down. And when it goes down below the potential value of that piece of data, then people should store everything. And that's what leads to big data, right? I think
to kind of play devil's advocate there,
Yeah.
the storage might get cheap, but actually making sense of that
Sure.
data, doing stuff with it can
And there's a lot of technology that's needed to make it easier, which of course all the vendors are trying to help. But I thought, the case in point nowadays, recently with the unfortunate, Malaysian Airlines incident, tells you, I find it really amazing that in this day and age, we cannot, every phone here has a locate me feature, but we cannot find this airplane with, hundreds of people on it. Because we're not using the technologies that we already have to track every airliner out there, right? So I think you will see a lot more of those type of applications because that incremental cost of storing, and of course we have to provide the right analytics, but because that cost of storing is going down to zero compared to the value.
I Actually, I'd like to respond to that, and this comes along with some discussion that I had with some folks over lunch hour. The older the data gets, the less interesting it is, right? And so that's one of the problems of saying let's store every data, all the data we have is we're generating more and more of it, and the older value is dropping
You think
faster.
Amazon feels that way?
It depends.
Like to
Right.
add a line
Yeah.
to that.
Yeah.
It's with the cost analysis, well, not quite analysis, but the idea of that the storage cost goes down, but it would be actually like the cost for deciding what to delete is more expensive than just storing it. So.
Interesting point. Yeah, it's a different world out
Do
there.
you keep all the tweets? Can I find my tweets from 2007?
Indeed, in the fall of last year, we actually made it capable to download your entire archive of tweets. And that's not just a CSV file, that's actually a very nicely localized local web page you download that has a UI and everything containing all your tweets. That was a big engineering project, though, to make that available, to be able to generate it. And it's not quite real time. You make the request, and then we'll send you a notice when your archive is available for
Because the old
download.
stuff's on tape somewhere, right?
It's not on tape, but yeah, figuratively speaking.
On cheaper storage.
Exactly.
So I'm surprised you haven't mentioned this yet, but Twitter actually ran something a couple weeks ago where you could see your first ever tweet. You could go to this page and you can see your first tweet ever, and most of the time it's like either funny or it's like I didn't really. And like half of them from my friends, and they're all developers, and this was amazing. Half of those tweets were, "What does this do? How does this work? This network sucks."
What is the point of this?
That was
really
a
funny.
very prevalent tweet a few years ago. Okay. So big data is more than just hype. What does it enable? What can I do with big data?
Well, you can't do anything with big data, but with intelligence that you may be able to extract from it, right? I mean, this is to what you were talking about, right? How do you determine what has been successful that you've done in the past, right? How do you know whether you're wasting money doing certain types of user promotions? Who knows, right? Without actually being able to gain that intelligence, it's just data.
So maybe I can share some examples of applications of big data that some of our customers are using our platform for. So I mentioned briefly in the morning, we run a startup accelerator in Beijing. For the last 2 years, we've graduated about 50 companies through that accelerator program. It's 6 months each, so each batch is about 6 months. We've had a number of, I would say, big data application companies. So one example is a company that does geological analysis. So they have maps of underground, and they're trying to look for resources, whether it's oil and gas or other types of resources. And those data tend to be very, very big, obviously, right? So they're applying analytics to that. There's other companies that are doing analytics on healthcare data. Obviously, healthcare is a very important issue in China with the population, the aging population. They're trying to figure out diseases and sort of the patterns within diseases. There's others doing financial analytics.
Whereas previously that would have been abstracted quite a fair amount, say 100
That's
years
right.
ago if you were
That's
doing
right.
public health.
Right. Another one which I'm personally working on is intelligent cities and how cities can leverage the incredible amounts of data that's now coming at them from not only their operational systems that they've had for a while, but increasingly from social media. What is people talking about my city on Twitter or Weibo or wherever, and from sensor networks. All these cameras going in, pollution detectors, all kinds of analytics, radiation detectors, and so on. So bringing all that data together to get a real-time view of your city and being able to do historical analytics, real-time analytics. Even we see some cases where people are doing predictive analytics of what will happen. So I think those are some interesting examples.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of times, kind of before big. Oh, yeah. Go ahead, please.
I have a question on big data in a sense that is very practical. I used to build a reporting system for my company at that time, and we extract data from our business information that we would have stored. And in a sense, it would be big data as well. So some manager would come to me, ask me as a developer, hey, can you get that information from the system? And I hear a lot about big data, like you now talk about, that it's a lot of information stored, it's out there. But how can we, as developers, make it easy, accessible from the system? And how can we bring them to that system? Because for a manager, they will ask, I want to have this information, but I don't want to pay for the big data system. How can I get to it that it becomes of value? And then we can help them to actually get the information, because they ask us, give me that information. But how can we go into that?
I think this is actually a very, very old question. And, you know, I may be older than I look, but many years ago, 15 or so, I worked in data warehousing. And of course, data warehousing had these exact same problems and the exact same questions, which is we dump a whole bunch of data into this data warehouse. Why can't we ask any arbitrary question of it? And the answer, of course, is because if you don't know what domain questions you're asking and what dimensions you want to slice things by, you can't build the data mart, which is the thing that's actually queryable, right? So until your manager wants to write MapReduce jobs to, you know, analyze this big data, your manager has to have an idea of what type of things they want to ask about. And this is, you know, we have customers, you know, they use Hadoop for their giant data repository, but if they know they're going to be querying on results of some analytics, then they run the Hadoop jobs and they put the results in MongoDB because that's good for fast operational querying, right?
So they take the stored value pairs and put them into more of a document model.
Well, actually, they try to put the results that are queryable by fewer dimensions than arbitrarily infinite number, right? But it's you know, none of it is free, and I saw a lot of heads nodding when I brought up data warehousing, right? Because that is a very strong analogy. We call it big data and we call it new, but of course none of it is new. It's just what's big is very relative now, right?
I think what's interesting is that there's been sort of the discussion, I think, and the reason partly for a lot of the confusion is that there's been a lot of sort of new technology coming out about this. Like Hive, for instance, is a way for you to query using SQL-like structure into like large data warehouses on Hadoop, right? I think that's, but that's a great tool, right? But so I think what's encouraging is that there's a lot of movement in that area, and I'm personally just looking for it. I mean, like at Dropbox, we use Hive internally to query our analytics database, and that's proved amazing because almost anyone can write a SQL query, or at least a very simple SQL query. So I think it's starting to. I think there is a process where we're starting to get these higher and higher level UIs on top of these just like large data warehouses, and I think that's something that's relatively new at this point.
And that's going to give value to managers because they like using tools.
Managers do like UIs.
May I add to that? I think it's a very important question, right? The big data term has stuck, but unfortunately it just says big data. But it's much more complex than that, right? It's all kinds of different data coming at you from different sources, some with schema, some without schema. Some require Hadoop-style processing, some require streaming processing, some require relational, some require OLAP. So it's just data in many different forms. And so the big part, handling large amounts, is one part of the equation. Lots of time people just focus on that big part. But I think some of the issues around how do you make it easy for end users who are not experts, I may beg to differ in terms of writing SQL queries. The vast majority of people have no idea what the heck is a SQL query, right? There's this now profession being defined called data scientists. Guess what? People think in the US alone there'll be a shortage of 500,000 to 1 million of these people called data scientists. How are we going to deal with that? One way to deal with that is make it easier so that you don't have to have so many scientists to analyze your data. Make the tools really do the work.
Interesting point. We're certainly looking to hire some data scientists at Twitter, so any referrals out there, I'd be happy to take them. Ivan, you got a question? Can we get, who's got the mics?
You guys talk about big data and certain things, how you understand information. Like for example, like for health industry, there's certain thing in the system for hospitals, there's certain thing for pharmacists. Their data is completely different. And by using Sumner's, I'll give an example, like using semantic webs, you can find relevant data that can connect them together. So now you bridge the gap between pharmacists and hospitals. You can use completely different data set. As they're growing, do you see there's somebody will build some sort of better scheme or algorithm that improvising, connecting everything together that makes sense maybe? Not just for getting information, but also improving like other industry for references and so forth. I mean, there's a lot of processing power with cloud, obviously. But I don't know, is that the direction we're going on or something that people may think of doing it? Because I see health industry trying to do it. Perhaps you can use the same technology on everything else, like obviously real estate or, you know, stock market and so forth. So that's something that I was curious. Is that part of the thing instead of having to hire a lot of data scientists, keep doing the manual thing, just having the web just do it themselves, like a small AI, a little bit of time capabilities.
So we don't have Skynet here. What do we have today?
Actually, for an audience of startups, this is a great startup opportunity. Actually, there are not just a new opportunity, there are existing companies who are making a business out of bringing their data, public data, to the market in a usable form. And they do all the curation, whether it's stock market data, transportation data, pollution data, whatever it might be. They are doing the curation. They will make sure it's up to date, it's accurate. They may have a freemium model where you can look at some data for free, but if you really want a corporate subscription, you pay for it. Those models are emerging. Actually, we host a marketplace on Azure where those companies can come and offer that, that type of service.
Yeah. I mean, there certainly is a lot of potential for startups out there to get your creative juices flowing. I think I saw another question over there.
So Prakash was making a point about like whether we should store everything and why are we not storing everything. And the gentleman over there was asking like how to make data more easily accessible to everyone. I have a further point to make. How do we make data harder to access for everyone, especially people who shouldn't? There's like a lot of recent discussion about surveillance and obviously privacy. Yeah. How do we ensure that how do you balance the issues of developer wanting to store everything versus like people not wanting the information to be stored?
Sure, the ethics of big data.
Well, it's interesting because, as soon as you mention something like healthcare, right, the US government has regulations about data regarding individuals and health, and EU has regulations, and I'm sure here there's plenty of regulations, and of course, the great thing about regulations is they're all different, right? So, what the tool makers can do is obviously just, make it easier for the data scientists and the data collectors to secure their data, but ultimately the responsibility, I think, is with the producers and the consumers of the data. This is why a lot of the data is not public, because I think there is a concern about just how much information, surveillance, right? You're in a public place, but you really weren't expecting that the information about which public places you were in would be available forever, right? So there are definitely issues here.
And I have a few Facebook posts I wouldn't mind taking back.
That you wish weren't public.
Certainly. I think that's a great question and a great area. I actually think there's going to be quite a development of this kind of policy, and they'll see a lot more policy roles, and that'll become a more prevalent role at companies. Certainly at Twitter, we have quite a lot of policy people that are working on what data should we keep, and we actually throw away a lot of data. So anytime we want to keep data, we kind of have to make sure that it jives with what our policies are.
Well, I have a question to you about Twitter. Are you subject, EU has laws that mean that the mobile companies are not allowed to keep information past, I think it's 6 months or something, right? Because they know where you were just by tracking your phone. But of course now the application that's running on the phone also knows where you were. Is that something that you guys are subject to?
So we do have offices in the EU, so we absolutely are subject to EU. So we have a large office in Dublin. So I don't think I'm quite the right person to speak on our policies around that,
Sure.
but we certainly are subject to those.
But that is something that's a challenge, right? You write an app, suddenly you're gathering information that may make you subject to, you know, are you breaking the law in EU as soon as you have your first EU user, right?
And when you talk about the EU, it does get really interesting. I mean, they have all these different notions, like the right to be forgotten, which is great from a kind of metaphysical sense, but when you think about actually implementing the right to be forgotten, it gets really difficult.
Especially when you talk about big data and how cheap it is to keep forever just because you forgot where you put it.
But I think the key point which you made, Josh, is more than a technology question, that question is a policy question. The technology can do whatever it is we want it to do. We need to figure out as a society what it is that we want, what are the rules of the road here going to be. And that's much more of a public policy discussion.
I think even beyond that, I would say it's also a product question. I think what's interesting is how do you make your product easy to use, yet at the same time, how do you make it just simple for people to know when their data is provided to the you know, a company, how it's going to be used, and how do you make it extremely easy for them to opt out, or that's tricky, and that's not something that we've necessarily focused on that much as an industry, I find.
One thing I always, following up on that, I always like to encourage developers is, I mean, there used to be this thought, oh, we put up a privacy policy. That's not really that effective. No one reads those. What's more important is contextual privacy policies. When you're collecting data within a form, within a web page, make it, you know, clear what you're collecting, how it's going to be stored, how it's going to be used at that time. But of course that's not easy to do, but I think that's a step in the right direction.
Yeah. If nobody else is asking questions, it's good that he is.
I understand you guys talking about privacy is a big issue. I have experience of seeing different social media or seeing certain information like user wasn't educated. So they put like, for example, their sex, male, female, and so forth. But based on that information publicly, even without identifying the person's name, without, if you get enough information, you can figure out the address of that person, the household, and the age group, which you can identify the actual identity of the person. So obviously, that's something not every company can control, obviously, policy-wise. I mean, you do a good job on it, maybe the other company have other leakage of certain information, but having that out on the internet, I mean, I'm not saying we need somebody to police that information, but is there a way you can perhaps educating the user to be a lot more carefully how they put the information out and pay attention to more privacy rules?
Yeah, I mean, educating the user, I certainly, like as I just said, I believe in like really putting it in the context of as it's being collected. But I mean, there's a lot of challenges, and like there's a famous example where AOL took a very big data set and wanted to give a gift to researchers, put this data out to the researchers, what they thought was completely anonymized, had several data scientists look at it and say, oh yeah, this is anonymized, no one's ever going to figure out who it is. And then several other researchers out at universities took that as a challenge and started to identify names and people and all kinds of stuff from that data set, and it became quite a debacle for AOL. I mean, this was a few years ago now, and that was, I think, a big learning lesson for people out there. I mean, it's very challenging when you're collecting everything. Another good way, and this was mentioned, is to throw away data. Maybe in some cases you don't want to keep data. I mean, certainly like in the EU case, it's some ways times the only way to comply might be just to throw away that data and not keep it. And so it's kind of a case-by-case basis, but that's certainly a challenge we want to wrestle with. Especially, of course, if it's even more expensive to delete the data than keep it.
Or maybe there would be a chance for a new startup for Forget as a service or something.
Deleting data as a service.
Well, there was the suicide machine for Facebook for a while, but that got sued out of existence. Where, because they would actually not just terminate your Facebook account, but first they would go through and delete every post and then terminate your Facebook account. Of course, they no longer exist, but.
I think there are also market solutions to some of these issues, right? We as users, all of us, also have some power on what apps we subscribe to and what we don't. You talked about growth hacking. It might actually be a good business practice to require the least amount of information from the user. It reduces friction as well as addresses some of the privacy concerns. You know, if you look at WhatsApp, for example, I think one of the keys to their viral adoption was how easy it is to actually onboard. All you need is a phone number.
Sort of elaborating on what you're saying, I I definitely agree in principle that yeah, you should try to collect as little data as possible. And then the cool thing with that is that it opens up a whole line of product development. When you want to request more data from the user, you can design that experience. You can make clear what the value of providing that data is. I prefer apps that, that encourage me to have a profile picture because it'll help people identify me, not because it's in a form and you need it to register. And sort of like tying the value to the data that's provided or by the user is an interesting design challenge for apps, and it's going to be an interesting new concern.
Mm-hmm. So we've talked about big data, and we only have another 15 minutes. We're also supposed to talk about cloud in this panel. So I'd like to, since we have some cloud people up here, I'd kind of like to maybe talk a bit about the cloud. And I mean, cloud's a term that's been around for a while now. I mean, it was in university textbooks for years where they'd represent the cloud as the network. Now it's come to mean a lot more. It means all this data living in the cloud. Where's the cloud going? What kind of challenges is it facing, and what's in the future for it?
Which way is the wind? Are you asking which way the wind is blowing? See what I did there?
Yeah.
It's no longer the current buzzword. It's big data. So,
Your cloud's been usurped by big data?
well, in terms of being buzzword, yeah. So.
No, go ahead, please.
No, I think just for me, living in China for the last few years, maybe it's an interesting perspective. When I first got there, which I've been there now for 6.5 years, first when I got there, nobody knew what cloud was. That changed very quickly. A year in, everybody was talking about cloud, but kind of like your reference earlier in this session, nobody was doing it, but everybody was talking about it, right? But then, in the last few years, it has gotten very real. Whether they are doing public cloud or private cloud or hosted cloud, that might be different. But the movement is certainly maturing in terms of, 3 years ago, VCs would tell us in China that cloud will never take off in China. People are too sensitive about wanting to have their own data in their own control, so on their own premises. Even startups are going to buy their own hardware. It took 1 year, just 1 year, for that to flip 180 degrees on its end. Now, no startup in China or elsewhere would think about buying their own servers and putting that in, right? So I think there's definitely, the flip has happened. But in terms of the bell curve or the crossing the chasm, I think we're in the middle of crossing the chasm with the adoption, majority of the adoption yet to come.
I actually would, I think the cloud as a concept is a huge equalizer in terms of especially startups. I mean, it did for startups what internet did for communication, for getting information to everyone. Because the fact is that, and we see this a lot because so many people, when they're a startup, they go, oh, MongoDB is easy to use. There's a couple of cloud providers that provide Mongo as a service. And all of a sudden, you don't have to go to VCs for millions of dollars because a few $100,000 will get you going and hopefully acquired by somebody for billions.
Yeah, and in many ways, the way I see it, the dot bust, the failure of the original dot-com bubble, was that the internet was taken off, but the cloud wasn't there yet. So if you were starting a startup, you had to go buy an EMC storage machine, you had to buy Oracle.
Co-hosting.
Yeah. You were a few $1 million in before you even got started. And so there were a lot of great ideas, a lot of business ideas. They were just too expensive to implement. And now the cloud's really kind of turned that on its own.
I mean, I want to reiterate that Dropbox is still using Amazon Web Services today to store data. And that's probably one of the best examples of, it didn't take us, storing a lot, that's a lot of data to store, by the way. So, yeah, I totally agree with your point.
You have an idea, there's a cloud out there to deploy it.
So and the flips happen, cloud is taken off, it's not even a buzzword anymore. There's so many cloud providers out there. How do I evaluate the cloud? How do I know who to trust?
I think there's what's interesting is that there are multiple levels of services you can get, right? I think the cloud is, at this point, so there's a lot of low level, I think the the ecosystem right now, if you want a Mongo database, if you want a MySQL database, if you want just raw compute power, just these raw resources are easy to get. What's interesting is that these like new higher level services are starting
Exactly.
Like
to
a
come
Dropbox?
out.
Like Dropbox.
Like a Dropbox, shameless plug. But I mean, you can look at things like Office 365. You can look at things like there's this trend in the market where the cloud is going to start providing a lot more than just resources, and that's where we can start doing some pretty cool things.
Yeah, it's almost like watching the computer turn into something with layers of operating systems and services that make it easier to use, right? You know, to deploy in the cloud, you still have to have somebody who understands the OS, but if something is as a service, then you just get a nice UI, right?
The cloud is the computer?
Yeah, you know, I think Sun got a lot of flack for that. I think they were just before their time when they said the network is the computer, right?
No, I want to answer your question though. I think different customers will give you a different answer for why or what they look for in a cloud provider, how to make a choice. Enterprise customers, for example, they still want to have that relationship with their vendor that they trust, you know, one neck to choke, support, all this kind of stuff, which is very, very important to them. Maybe more important than some other issues like, I'm not saying price is not important, but that might not be the only metric. Versus some startup that wants to use a cloud, but they want a very frictionless on-ramp, cheap price, maybe free for the first few years, those type of things, right? You were talking about apps, don't make them slow, fast response. Maybe that is something that's really important to people, so they want somebody who has a local data center. People want a cloud that is global so that they can build once and deploy globally. Or they want to go into mainland China, you know, again, for a Hong Kong audience, that might be super important. So I think different customers will give you different answers about what are the factors that influence them to choose a cloud provider.
Yeah, absolutely. Where do big data and the cloud meet, to bring our two topics of this?
Where do they meet?
Yeah.
Upper stratosphere.
Well, I mean,
In a thunderstorm?
in practical terms, right, one of the things that makes the cloud attractive is it's easy to both scale up and scale down your capacity. You pay for what you need. If you decide you don't need half of the data you've been accumulating, or if you decide you don't want to be analyzing as much of the data as if you've been analyzing, you know, undeploy it, and you no longer have to pay for it, which you couldn't do in the old days when you committed to a year at some hosting facility and hired, you know, 7 sysadmins to run it. So it's definitely much more dynamic.
Yeah, one thing, Prakash, in your presentation I thought was interesting is you talked about the mobile SDK and how that turned into the cloud. Is the cloud just becoming client-server again?
You know, okay, I'll make a statement that might be provocative and I'll get slammed for it, but you know, computer science, I think we only have like 5 concepts, okay?
Yeah.
And we keep recycling them. We give them a new name every decade, okay?
That's how we keep it interesting.
Client server, now it's mobile and cloud.
Data warehousing is now big data.
Big data, and you know, in the world of databases, we have only a few concepts. It's either relational or hierarchical or network. We just reinvent the same concepts, call them XML, call them object databases, and give them new names. Okay, so anyway, that's my soapbox. But
No, that's true.
but I think the scale is obviously unprecedented, right? The scale of the mobile ecosystem, the scale of the coming embedded ecosystem, the Internet of Things, and the cloud infrastructure that supports it, there have never been this scale of infrastructure before. And you asked about cloud and big data, I think they're both sort of mutually reinforcing. There could not be big data without cloud, and the cloud is growing so fast because of all the data coming in.
There's also just a lot more computing now. If you look at the history of computing, you know, the first mainframes were all these text-based interfaces, and that had so much adoption. Then we had a mouse and GUI, and whoa, that's 100x. Then it's touch now, and that's 100x what mouse and GUI were. So it's just driving the need for all this data and all this cloud.
Right. And, you know, it's all relative, right? Because 10 years ago, whatever the biggest data we had, I'm sure seemed outlandishly big. On the other hand, if I think about the mainframes of old, I'm fairly certain my phone has more processing power than the first mainframe that I ever accessed, right?
Yeah, your phone has many times the power of the entire Apollo missions
Yeah.
that put man on the moon.
Yeah, there you go. And it's the same with storage, it's the same with memory. And so even though the amount of data is growing exponentially, we get a lot more computing power to deal with it, and we get to just invent new words for the old concepts, right?
Yeah.
The winner will be the one who comes.
Well, any other final questions from the audience? Can we get a mic over here?
Yeah, sorry, we don't have answers for it.
I have a question about the feasibility of starting a big data analytics company. I mean, for you to start such a company, first you must have a wide spectrum of sources for acquiring such gigantic volume of data, and then you must have access to high quality storage and also super strong processing capacities using servers or supercomputers or whatever. So how do startups solve these problems? Are they just buying services from providers like Amazon AWS or Microsoft Azure, or instead they rely on something else? And the second part of my question is, more generally speaking, what do you think those startups have? What competitive advantage do they have versus the big names like IBM or Microsoft or Amazon, who have already entered this newly emerged market of data analytics with strong resource advantage and full momentum? Thank you.
So I don't think I have enough. So I don't work that much on big data. But I think your question's awesome because I think it's a testament to the power of startups. Is not. I don't think you win against Amazon on computing power or on storage space. But what you do, however, is you innovate on how you look at the data itself, and I think that's where the potential is. It's like a new way of solving sort of the meta problem. It's not about how many cores or how many gigabytes. I think it's about what you do with the data, and that's how I would sort of preface the other answers to the question.
Yeah, and that echoes my experience and my thoughts on this as well. First of all, I know a couple of startups, folks who started analytics, big data analytics type companies, startups, really, they're still very small. They use the cloud. They use the cloud so that they could be dynamic and responsive to wherever their efforts led them to, right? If they needed to pivot and have different resources, they would rent those resources, right? But the main thing is, a big company, a couple of people have a bright idea at a big company. There are very few companies in which they have the freedom to just go and innovate, right? Even if it's a company that gives them some free time to do that, that's very different from somebody who, puts their, whether it's the next
Lives
3
and
months or
breathes.
3 years of their career on the line because they believe that something will be of enough value to enough people, right, to make a difference. And I think that's what brings innovation forward, is enough people having these kind of ideas. A few of them are going to be real gems.
So it might seem easier to think that analytics is just easier to build as a function inside a company, right? Because you get access to the resources, you get access to the data, but if you want to really sort of meta innovate on how to actually deal with the data, I find it's going to be more likely to come from the outside. That's exactly what you're saying, essentially.
Yeah, I think so.
And just the proof point that startups do succeed. I mean, most startups fail, but a lot succeed. And there's always entrenched competitors that they're going after. I mean, and we talk about Amazon. I mean, they went after Walmart. Who would have ever thought they had a chance against Walmart when they got started? Well, now who's the one who's afraid?
I think going back to the points you guys made, the sort of platform level big data innovation, I think that already started 4 or 5 years ago. If I was a startup, I would not be starting that today, right? Companies like, not only Amazon, Microsoft, but, Splunk and Pivotal and a variety of others, they're investing huge amounts in building the platform. So if I was a startup, which is what I see in the startups that we mentor and coach in our program, they're looking at higher level, how can I use that capability in particular domains, whether it's finance or healthcare or education or geology or whatever it might be. How can I use this new capacity to build something that hasn't been built before get new value.
Yeah, well, thank you.
And Twitter didn't really start out intending to be Twitter, did they?
Yeah, I mean, Twitter was originally a hack project, right? It was a hack night project of a failed startup called Odia, and it took off. So, well, thank you for all the questions, and thank you to the panelists for the great answers. And
Thank you. Best of luck.
As we go along.
Our moderator and panelists, please stay for the group photo. Maybe also invite visiting for Internet Society Hong Kong to take the group photo.